Doctor Lyra Kenobi stood frozen in the observation dome, her luminescent silver hair catching the double moonlight, as 600 pounds of apex predator cubs charged directly at her sleeping mat, and she had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether this was affection or her final moment alive. The Vrakhen younglings had never shown this behavior before, not in the 8 months she'd been studying them on this remote research station at the edge of charted space, and definitely not with that peculiar chirping sound they were making that sent her alien heart hammering against her ribs. They were supposed to be in their containment habitat, not here, not now, not barreling toward her with their obsidian claws extended and their triple rows of teeth gleaming in the dim light. Lyra's mind raced through emergency protocols even as her body remained perfectly still, because running triggered their chase instinct, and she'd seen what these cubs did to fleeing prey, even in play. The lead cub, Zephyr, whom she'd hand-raised from a hatchling, reached her first, and she braced for impact. But instead of the violent tackle she expected, the massive predator carefully, almost tenderly, pressed its scaled forehead against her shoulder and made that chirping sound again, softer now, almost questioning. "Easy, Zephyr," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible, her pointed ears flattening slightly against her skull in that involuntary fear response she'd never quite conquered, despite her years of xenobiology training. The other 5 cubs surrounded her now, their heat radiating through her fitted tactical suit, their breathing synchronized in a way that should have been menacing, but somehow wasn't. And that's when she noticed they were all holding something in their massive jaws. Blankets. They were carrying the thermal blankets from the supply closet, the ones she'd used just last night when she'd shown the human consultant, Marcus Webb, how she'd been teaching the cubs basic environmental adaptation. Marcus. This had to be his fault somehow, she thought, with a mixture of exasperation and something warmer she wasn't quite ready to name. The Earth-born behavioral specialist had arrived at the station 3 weeks ago, and in that short time, he'd somehow managed to turn her carefully structured research protocols into what he called actual relationship building, which apparently meant treating apex predators like they were pets, instead of the galaxy's most efficient killing machines. The previous evening flooded back to her now as Zephyr gently pushed her toward her sleeping mat with his snout, the memory playing out in vivid detail behind her expressive violet eyes. Marcus had been sitting cross-legged in the habitat enclosure, completely unauthorized and thoroughly unsafe, reading a children's book to the cubs like they were kindergartners, instead of creatures that would grow to the size of earth elephants with 10 times the aggression. "You're going to get yourself killed," she'd hissed from the observation window, her fingers drumming against the console in that nervous habit she'd developed since childhood on Meridian Prime. He'd just smiled that infuriating human smile, all confidence and warmth, and gestured for her to join him. "Trust me, Lyra. They're smart enough to understand routine and ritual. It's not about the words, it's about the pattern, the comfort, the security of knowing what comes next." She'd descended into the habitat against every instinct her species possessed. Meridians were logical, careful, calculating, not reckless like humans, but something about Marcus made her want to be braver than she was. "This is called bedtime," Marcus had explained to the cubs, who were watching him with unusual focus, their normally aggressive posturing completely absent. "On Earth, parents tuck their children in at night. It's a way of saying you're safe, you're loved. And tomorrow will come with new adventures," he demonstrated with the smallest cub, Nixie, carefully arranging a blanket over her scales and patting her head gently. "You settle down, get comfortable, and someone you trust makes sure you're warm and protected." Lyra had watched, fascinated despite herself, as the cubs responded to this alien ritual, their predatory instincts seemingly overridden by something deeper, some universal need for security that transcended species. "Humans do this every night?" she'd asked, genuinely curious, because Meridians slept in solitary pods, alone and efficient, no touching, no ritual, no warmth beyond temperature regulation. "The good ones do," Marcus had replied, and there was something in his voice, some old wound or longing, that made her wonder what kind of childhood the behavioral specialist had experienced. Now, as the cubs carefully arranged themselves around her sleeping mat, Lyra understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity what was happening. They were trying to tuck her in. Zephyr draped a thermal blanket across her legs with surprising delicacy for a creature with claws that could shred durasteel. Nixie, always the gentlest, carefully adjusted another blanket over Lyra's shoulders, that same patting motion Marcus had demonstrated, just done with a paw the size of Lyra's head. The other four cubs formed a protective circle, lying down in synchronized movement, creating a living barrier between her and the rest of the world. It was simultaneously the most dangerous and most touching moment of her entire scientific career, and she found her eyes growing wet with tears. Another embarrassing human behavior she'd picked up since Marcus's arrival: Meridians didn't cry. They processed emotions through meditation and logical analysis. "What have you done to them?" she whispered, knowing Marcus was watching from the observation deck above, his shift, monitoring the nocturnal behavior patterns. His voice came through her comm link, warm with barely suppressed laughter. "I showed them love, Lyra, and they're showing it back to you. That's what social creatures do." She wanted to argue, to cite research papers about anthropomorphization and the dangers of projecting mammalian behavior patterns onto alien species. But Zephyr chose that moment to rest his enormous head on her lap, looking up at her with eyes that reflected the starlight filtering through the dome. And every scientific objection died in her throat. "They've never been this calm," she admitted, running her fingers carefully along the ridge of scales behind Zephyr's ears. A spot she'd discovered was sensitive, almost ticklish. Not even when they were hatchlings. The comm link carried Marcus's response with that characteristic thoughtfulness she'd come to associate with his analysis. "Because you've never let yourself be vulnerable with them before. You've been the scientist, the observer, the provider. But tonight, you're letting them care for you. That's trust, Lyra. That's family. Family." The word echoed in her mind as she lay there, covered in blankets and surrounded by sleeping predators who should have seen her as either threat or food, but instead saw her as something worth protecting. Her own family back on Meridian Prime wouldn't understand this. They'd be horrified at the breach of protocol, the emotional contamination of research, the sheer illogical danger of her situation. But lying here, feeling the synchronized breathing of the cubs create a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, Lyra realized she didn't care about Meridian standards anymore. Marcus had taught her something in 3 weeks that 8 months of observation had missed. These cubs weren't just research subjects, they were individuals, capable of complex emotions and social bonding that went beyond pack hierarchy and survival instinct. "You should come down here," Lyra said into the comm, surprising herself with the invitation. There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken possibility, before Marcus replied. "Is that Dr. Kenobi making a request, or Lyra inviting a friend?" She smiled, her first genuine smile in what felt like weeks of careful, professional distance. "The latter, I think. Though the doctor is curious about your methodology." She heard his footsteps on the access stairs, the familiar rhythm she'd unconsciously memorized from countless shifts together, analyzing data and debating approaches to xenobiology versus human intuition. When Marcus entered the habitat dome, moving slowly so as not to startle the cubs, Lyra saw him differently than she had in their previous interactions. Not as the reckless human who disregarded safety protocols, but as someone who understood something fundamental that her species had forgotten, or perhaps never known: that connection required risk, and love demanded vulnerability. Marcus settled carefully beside her sleeping mat, just outside the ring of cubs, and Nixie immediately shuffled over to include him in the circle, draping her tail across his lap like an afterthought. "They've accepted you completely," Lyra observed, watching how naturally Marcus ran his hand along Nixie's scales. "No fear, no hesitation." "You did this with Earth animals?" He nodded, his expression distant with memory. "I grew up on a wildlife rehabilitation station in the African preserve. Raised everything from lion cubs to elephants that had lost their families to poachers or climate disasters. My parents taught me that every creature, no matter how dangerous, how alien, how different from us, they all need the same things: food, safety, and to know they mattered to someone." Lyra absorbed this, adding it to the growing file of Marcus Webb observations she kept in her mind, cross-referenced with her own confused feelings about the human who disrupted her careful, lonely existence. "Meridians don't do this," she said quietly, gesturing at the cubs, at Marcus, at the whole intimate scene. "We're raised in education cohorts, no family units, no bedtime rituals, no tucking in. Efficiency and logic above emotional bonding." Marcus looked at her with those deep brown eyes that seemed to see past her alien features to something fundamentally similar underneath. "How's that working out for you?" he asked, gentle, but direct. The question hit harder than it should have, finding all the lonely places she'd pretended didn't exist. I used to think it worked perfectly, Lyra admitted, her fingers absently stroking Zephyr's scales. But then you showed up and broke all my carefully constructed protocols. And now I'm lying under a pile of predator cubs, feeling more at home than I ever did in the Meridian Research Academy. Zephyr stirred, lifting his massive head to regard Marcus with what Lyra had learned to recognize as curiosity rather than aggression. The cub made that chirping sound again, then carefully extracted himself from the pile and approached the human. Lyra tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward the neural disruptor on her belt, but Marcus remained perfectly calm as 600 pounds of apex predator sniffed him thoroughly. He's deciding if you're pack, Marcus explained, keeping his voice low and even. Zephyr's the alpha among the cubs. If he accepts me being this close to you, the others will follow. Lyra's heart hammered as Zephyr completed his inspection, the moment stretching into eternity. And then the massive cub did something she'd never seen in 8 months of observation. He gently gripped Marcus's arm in his jaws, careful not to break skin, and pulled him closer to Lyra's sleeping mat. I think you're being tucked in too, Lyra laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. Marcus allowed himself to be maneuvered until he was sitting beside her, his shoulder touching hers. And Zephyr promptly draped a third thermal blanket over both of them before settling down with his head across their legs. The other cubs adjusted their positions to accommodate the new arrangement, and within moments, Lyra and Marcus were completely enclosed in a living fortress of scaled warmth and synchronized breathing. This is highly unprofessional, Lyra murmured, but she didn't move away. Completely inappropriate, Marcus agreed, his hand finding hers under the blanket, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both brand new and ancient as starlight. Also the best moment of my entire assignment, she added, feeling his thumb trace circles on her palm. Such a simple touch, but it sent cascades of sensation through her nervous system that no meridian meditation could have prepared her for. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the twin moons rise higher through the transparent dome, casting silver and blue light across the habitat. Lyra's mind wandered through the implications of this moment, the report she'd have to file, the questions from her supervisors, the potential scandal of emotional involvement with both the research subjects and the human consultant. But for once, the logical part of her brain that had governed every decision since childhood was quiet, overruled by the feeling of Marcus's hand in hers, and the weight of Zephyr's head on her lap, and the absolute certainty that this, right here, was exactly where she was supposed to be. Tell me about bedtime on Earth, she said softly, wanting to understand this ritual that had transformed her research and possibly her entire worldview. Tell me what it was like when you were a child. Marcus's voice took on that storytelling quality she'd noticed when he read to the cubs, warm and textured with memory. My mom would finish her rounds with the animals, and my dad would have hot chocolate waiting, real chocolate from the African cacao preserves. We'd sit on the porch of our habitat and watch the stars come out over the savannah, listening to the night sounds of Earth's wildlife. Then she'd tuck me in, literally, wrapping the blankets tight like a cocoon, and she'd say the same thing every night. Dream of tomorrow's wonders, Marcus. The world is big and strange and full of creatures waiting to teach you how to be human. Lyra felt her throat tighten with emotion at the beauty of that memory, at the contrast with her own childhood of sterile education pods and efficiency metrics. She sounds wise, Lyra managed. She was, Marcus said quietly. She died when I was 15, trampled by a panicked elephant during a solar storm. But the ritual stuck with me, this idea that bedtime isn't just about sleep. It's about processing the day, acknowledging you're safe, and preparing for new possibilities. Understanding bloomed in Lyra's mind, connecting dots she hadn't even known were there. That's why you do this work. Why you travel to research stations on the edge of space to study alien behavioral patterns. You're looking for her in every creature you help. Marcus nodded, his shoulder pressing slightly heavier against hers. And I'm finding pieces of her everywhere. In these cubs who just learned to show affection. In you, teaching me that not all aliens are actually alien. That underneath different skin and pointed ears and luminescent hair, we're all just trying to figure out how to connect. Lyra turned to look at him properly, their faces inches apart in the dim moonlight, and saw her own vulnerability reflected back at her. I've spent my whole life trying to be the perfect meridian scientist, she confessed. Logical, detached, objective. And in 3 weeks, you've made me feel more alive and terrified and hopeful than 26 years of careful emotional control. Is that a good thing? Marcus asked, his free hand coming up to gently tuck a strand of silver hair behind her pointed ear, the touch sending electricity down her spine. I don't know, Lyra admitted honestly. I don't have data for this. No research protocols. No prediction models. Marcus smiled, that wonderful human expression she'd grown to anticipate. That's called being alive. Lyra, welcome to the messy, unpredictable, absolutely beautiful chaos of actual existence. She leaned closer, drawn by something older than logic or training, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted like possibility and risk and the courage to choose connection over safety. The cubs stirred around them. Zephyr, lifting his head briefly to observe this new behavior, and then settled back down, apparently satisfied that this too was part of the bedtime ritual, part of pack bonding, part of family. When they finally pulled apart, Lyra rested her head on Marcus's shoulder, feeling his heart beat through the fabric of his shirt, strong and steady and reassuringly alive. What happens now? She asked, not just about tonight, but about everything, her research, her career with the Meridian Science Directorate, this impossible thing growing between her and the human who'd taught predators about love. Now, Marcus said, his arm wrapping around her shoulders as the cub's breathing deepened into actual sleep, we rest. We let ourselves be tucked in by creatures who learn that safety means caring for those who care for you. And tomorrow, we figure out the complicated stuff. Lyra smiled against his shoulder, her eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. She'd been fighting for months, maybe years. Very human approach, she murmured. Very effective approach, Marcus countered gently. Trust the process, Dr. Kenobi. She did trust it, Lyra realized as sleep began to claim her. She trusted the cubs who surrounded them in protective warmth, trusted Marcus, who'd shown her that science without heart was just data collection, and most surprisingly, she trusted herself to navigate this new territory without a map or protocol or logical framework. Zephyr's breathing synchronized with hers, and she felt Nixie's tail tighten slightly around Marcus's waist, and the other cubs shifted in their sleep to maintain the protective circle. This was their pack now, their strange, impossible, cross-species family built on bedtime rituals and mutual vulnerability. Tomorrow would bring questions and complications. She'd have to explain the breach of protocols, justify the emotional involvement, defend her methodology to superiors who'd never understand that sometimes the best science happens when you stop observing and start participating. But tonight, tucked in by apex predators who'd learned that love was worth expressing, held by a human who'd taught her that feelings weren't weaknesses but strengths, Lyra Kenobi allowed herself to simply be. Not a Meridian scientist, not a xenobiology expert, not the logical and detached observer she'd trained her whole life to become, just Lyra. A person learning that bedtime wasn't about ending the day, but about having someone care enough to make sure you felt safe in the darkness. Marcus? She whispered, already half asleep. Yeah, he replied, his voice heavy with drowsiness. Thank you for breaking my protocols. She felt him smile against her hair. Thank you for letting them break. Sweet dreams, Lyra. Dream of tomorrow's wonders. The last thing she registered before sleep claimed her completely was Zephyr's gentle chirp. A sound she now understood meant contentment, safety, home, and the feeling of being exactly where she belonged, tucked in by love in all its strange and beautiful forms. The observation logs would show that Dr. Lyra Kenobi and consultant Marcus Webb spent the night in the Vrakhen habitat, surrounded by 6 juvenile apex predators in a spontaneous display of cross-species bonding behavior previously undocumented in xenobiological literature. The logs would note synchronized sleep patterns, decreased stress hormones in both humans and cubs, and a fundamental shift in pack dynamics that suggested emotional intelligence far beyond previous estimates. But the logs wouldn't capture the real discovery of that night, that bedtime rituals, whether practiced by humans on Earth or adopted by alien predators on the edge of space, were never really about sleep at all. They were about the essential, universal need to know that you mattered enough for someone to tuck you in, to keep you warm, to stand guard while you rested, and to promise through action that tomorrow would come and you wouldn't face it alone. As twin moons set and the station's artificial dawn began its slow brightening, the cubs continued their vigil, and Lyra Kenobi smiled in her sleep, dreaming of a small boy on an African savanna learning about love from his mother, of predator hatchlings discovering that strength and gentleness could coexist, and of a lonely Meridian scientist who traveled across the stars only to find home in the most unexpected place, tucked in by those she'd come to study, but stayed to love. In that perfect space where science ended and family began,